This is where forgotten stories come back to life. Subscribe and be part of it. Ancestors on horseback, feathers catching wind, a herd of buffalo stretching to the horizon. This is the picture stamped onto coins, movie posters, and textbook covers as the definition of Native American. It reads as changeless, as if it had always been there, waiting on that grass since the beginning of time. It hadn't. The lifestyle in that picture is only a handful of human lifetimes old. Strip away the assumption of permanence, and what's left is a people whose deepest linguistic roots don't point toward open prairie at all. They point east, into wooded lake country, into a world of birch bark and wild rice, hundreds of miles from where the popular image plants them. And that's only the first thread that doesn't hold. Here is where it gets complicated. When geneticists sampled Y chromosomes, the genetic thread passed almost unchanged from father to son, a kind of surname written in molecules. From this nation's own Siouan relatives, they found something researchers themselves couldn't cleanly file. Not ancient native, not post-contact European. Something in between, argued over in published debate rather than settled in a textbook. And when scientists tried to trace the DNA of this tribe's most famous 19th century leader, standard testing simply failed. Failed so completely that an entirely new forensic method had to be invented just to get an answer. So the ancient Plains identity that people assume is bedrock turns out to be something closer to a recent reinvention, laid down on top of a woodland past, and underneath that, a bloodline more porous than anyone's postcard image admits. So if the buffalo-riding warrior isn't ancient, and the bloodline isn't simple, which part of the story people think they know is actually true? Now name them, the Lakota. And to understand how strange the real story gets, you first need the version most documentaries, textbooks, and even tribal pride narratives settle on. The consensus telling, the one that isn't wrong so much as incomplete. The Lakota are the westernmost and largest of the 7 council fires, the Oceti Sakowin, standing alongside their Dakota and Nakota-speaking relatives. Sioux, incidentally, isn't a name they gave themselves. It's a French trader's shortened version of an Ojibwe word for adder, a label stuck onto them from the outside. Most today prefer Lakota, or Oceti Sakowin, 7 fires. The standard oral tradition places sacred origin at Wind Cave, in the Black Hills, Paha Sapa, described as the site of the people's emergence onto the earth, the spiritual center of an entire worldview. In popular telling, the Lakota are the archetypal Plains nation. Horse culture, teepee, buffalo economy, the confederation that stopped Custer at Little Bighorn in 1876. 7 divisions in all, Teton, meaning Lakota proper, plus 6 additional Dakota and Nakota bands. 1 people, 1 confederacy, 1 continuous story. The image does the same work every time. Mounted, war-bonneted, buffalo herds on the horizon, always here, always like this. Reservation-era communities, Pine Ridge, Cheyenne River, Standing Rock, get folded into that same frame, treated as simple continuation of an ancient Plains lineage stretching back, in the popular imagination, almost indefinitely. Always, always, always. That word is doing a lot of work it can't actually support. Because historians and linguists studying the Siouan language family have quietly noticed something that doesn't fit an always plain story at all. Trace Lakota speech back through its deepest roots. And it doesn't lead to grassland. It leads somewhere with trees, lakes, and canoes. Continue the trace, and the anomaly starts with geography before it turns genetic. The linguistic and archaeological record agrees. Ancestors of the Lakota and Dakota were woodland and prairie people of the western Great Lakes region, what is now Minnesota and Wisconsin, long before any westward expansion began. Early European explorers didn't find horse-mounted buffalo hunters here. They found Dakota communities centered on Minnesota-Makoche, the land of Mille Lacs, a homeland named for a lake, not a plain. A 1683 French account is specific about what that homeland looked like. People cooking in earthen vessels, living in bark lodges, eating wild rice harvested from the shallows. A woodland economy, canoes, not horses. That detail alone recontextualizes everything Segment 2 just told you. The ancient Plains nation of popular imagination is, on the timescale that actually matters, a late-stage identity. The deep root is a Great Lakes people who hadn't yet become who the postcards show. Then the anomaly turns genetic, and this is where a real, named, peer-reviewed study enters the story. In 2006, a team led by Deborah Bolnick, alongside Daniel Bolnick and David Glenn Smith, researchers affiliated with the University of Texas at Austin and UC Davis, published a study in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution. They had sampled Y chromosomes from multiple eastern native populations, including Sisseton and Wahpeton Sioux communities. looking for patterns in the ancient paternal record. What they found was a haplogroup. Think of it as a distinct branch on the human family tree, identifiable by a shared set of genetic markers passed down the male line, labeled RM173. And among the Sioux samples specifically, it clustered, formed its own distinct group, stood apart. Here's the catch, and researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. The status of RM173 in this context has been genuinely disputed. Some argue it represents an ancient founding Native American lineage, present since the earliest peopling of the continent. Others argue the opposite, that it reflects European admixture, arriving centuries later through contact, trade, and everything trade quietly brings with it. This is not settled history. It is an open argument between credentialed scientists, conducted in journal pages, not campfire stories. Clean lineage, ancient founder, or recent arrival, 300 years deep, hiding inside a bloodline that looks ancient from the outside. Not by years, by centuries. And the stakes only rise from there, because the most scrutinized Lakota bloodline in American history belongs to the most famous Lakota leader of all, Sitting Bull. Standard DNA testing, applied to his documented living descendants, simply failed to produce a clean answer. Not an inconclusive answer, a methodological dead end, forcing scientists to build something new just to get a result at all, a detail this script will return to. One theory says the anomaly is ancient, another says it's a 300-year-old secret hiding in plain sight. Both can't be right. The first theory says the explanation isn't genetic at all, it's military, and it's about guns. Beginning in the 1600s and accelerating through the 1700s, the Ojibwe, also known as the Anishinaabe, had acquired firearms through their own trade relationships with European fur companies. That advantage in weaponry translated directly into territorial pressure, and it pushed Dakota and Lakota ancestors steadily out of their Great Lakes homeland and westward, year by year, generation by generation. The timeline is specific, not vague. Ojibwe expansion into northeastern Minnesota, beginning around 1740, combined with the growing pull of bison hunting on the open prairie beyond, to draw Dakota communities away from Mille Lacs for good. It hadn't always been hostile. An early peace agreement at Fond du Lac in 1679 initially allowed Ojibwe bands to move toward the Mississippi in exchange for fur trade goods. Cooperation, for a while. But by the 1730s, that arrangement had broken down entirely, opening roughly a century of open warfare between the two nations, a conflict that ran until separate reservations were eventually carved out for each. Layer onto that a second, entirely separate historical current, the horse itself. It didn't arrive on the northern plains from nowhere, and it certainly wasn't there from the beginning. Horses spread north along trade networks originating in Spanish New Mexico, and that spread only accelerated after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 disrupted Spanish control over their herds. Which means the eternal mounted buffalo culture, the very image this story opened on, is itself no older than the early to mid-1700s, younger than the United States Constitution by less than a century. Guns pushed a woodland people west. Horses gave them a new economy once they arrived. Together, those two forces explain the geography, the timeline, the total transformation from bark lodge to teepee, from canoe to horseback. But researchers are careful to note what this migration and horse adoption model doesn't explain. It says nothing at all, about why a specific, contested, possibly European-linked Y-chromosome lineage shows up clustering specifically among Sioux-affiliated samples, centuries after the fact. The guns and the horses explain the journey west. They don't explain what else moved into the bloodline along the way. What else moved into the bloodline along the way wasn't a mystery of geography, it was a mystery of intimacy. Because the fur trade was never only an economic arrangement between nations. It was, in thousands of documented cases, a sexual one. The same 2006 study that flagged the disputed RM173 lineage carried a second number, one far harder to argue away. Across the eastern native population sampled, at least 34.2%, plus or minus 3, of Y chromosomes showed clear evidence of recent, post-contact admixture. And the authors were careful to note that if additional ambiguous lineages were folded in, that figure could climb as high as 47.7%, nearly half. Here's what makes that number more than a statistic. It isn't symmetrical. Researchers examined the maternal side too, mitochondrial DNA, the genetic thread passed down only from mother to child, like a single unbroken sentence read backward through generations, and found almost no non-native signal there at all. The imbalance sits entirely on the paternal side. European ancestry entering, generation after generation, almost exclusively through the father's line. That asymmetry tells its own story, and it's not a subtle one. It points to European men, traders, voyageurs, company agents, fathering children with native women, not the reverse. Historians have a term for the unions this produced during the fur trade era: country marriages, relationships that were often stable, often long-term, and almost never recorded in the way a European parish register would record a marriage. Depending on how researchers classify the ambiguous cases, the estimated admixture in the broader eastern region runs somewhere between 36.6 and 52.5%. This is the mini-twist that Theory 1 never saw coming. The clean version of the story, pushed west by Ojibwe guns, transformed by Spanish horses, emerging on the other side as a distinct plains nation, assumes the bloodline itself stayed intact through that journey. The genetics say otherwise. Well before Wounded Knee, well before Little Bighorn, before the reservation system existed even as an idea, the paternal line of these woodland-turned plains communities was already, quietly, being reshaped by generations of European fathers, a change invisible in language, invisible in ceremony, invisible in every marker of identity that mattered to the people living it, but sitting there in the Y-chromosome the entire time. Researchers are quick to hedge this finding, and rightly so. The sampling here comes from broader eastern Siouan and Algonquian populations, not a large Lakota-specific cohort built for this exact question. That's a real gap, not a footnote to bury. But the pattern is strong enough and consistent enough across related nations that it raises an uncomfortable question the pushed west narrative never had to answer. If the paternal bloodline was already compromised generations before anyone thought to call it that, how far back does always been Lakota actually go? This is the part where the science stops agreeing with itself. The third theory, and it's the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud in plain terms, pushes back against the admixture reading entirely. Some geneticists argue that RM173, in at least some of the samples, may not represent European introduction after 1492 at all. It may represent something older, an ancient founding Native American lineage, present since long before any European ship reached this coast. It's a minority position, but it is a real one, defended in peer-reviewed argument, not folklore. That disagreement sits inside a larger, still unresolved controversy in the population genetics of the Americas. A scattering of anomalous haplogroups on both the paternal and maternal side, whose deep origins remain genuinely contested among specialists. Lakota-specific ancient DNA, addressing this directly, is thin on the ground. That's an open research gap, not a settled fact. And this is the part the records simply don't explain yet. And underneath the science sits something the science was never built to settle. Genetic ambiguity like this collides, directly and often painfully, with tribal enrollment policy and blood quantum politics. A space where geneticists and native scholars frequently disagree about what a DNA result should even mean for who counts as Lakota. Kim Tallbear, a native studies scholar at the University of Alberta, has cautioned for years against treating genetic findings like these as some kind of final verdict. A genuine, published pushback against letting a lab result outrun what a nation already knows about itself. The scientists can't agree on what the gene means. The tribe itself has never needed a laboratory to tell it who it is. So which one is supposed to settle this? Picture the edge of Mille Lacs, in what is now central Minnesota, sometime around 1700. Archaeologists have walked this exact ground. Cathio area village sites where French trade goods turn up buried alongside Sandy Lake and Oceti pottery, the traditional wares of the people who lived here first. This isn't a reconstruction built from guesswork. It's an excavated place, with an excavated timeline. Bark lodges line the shore. Wild rice, heavy on its stalks, is pulled from canoes into waiting baskets. The air carries the particular smell of clay cookware over a low fire. Children speak a language that will, in a few short generations, travel 500 miles west, transform beyond recognition in almost every way that matters to daily life, and still, underneath, be recognizable as the same tongue. Pressure is already building at the margins of this world. Ojibwe war parties, carrying French muskets acquired through their own trade alliances, press in from the northeast, closer with each passing season. And along the trade routes running south and west, strange rumors begin arriving. Stories of four-legged animals, tall and fast, used by nations far beyond anything these lake country families have ever seen with their own eyes. Somewhere in a village like this one, a single family makes a decision. Follow the bison herds west, rather than fight through another season of war they did not start. It is not a dramatic decision in the moment. It does not feel like the birth of a nation. But that same choice, made independently by family after family, band after band, across decades, that becomes the Lakota. Not a legend, a dated, located, factually grounded hinge point, the literal moment Woodland Dakota begins turning into Plains Lakota, one migration at a time. They look west. The story doesn't end there. It barely begins. Cut to 2007, inside a Smithsonian storage room, to a small paper envelope that had sat largely undisturbed for more than 100 years. Inside it, a lock of Sitting Bull's hair, held by the institution since the 19th century, finally repatriated to his descendants under U.S. repatriation law. For years, descendant Ernie LaPointe's claim to be Sitting Bull's great-grandson rested on paper alone. Birth records, death certificates, a hand-traced family tree, nothing a laboratory had ever confirmed. And ordinarily, DNA could settle a question like this easily enough. Standard testing leans on the Y-chromosome to trace a paternal line, or on mitochondrial DNA to trace a maternal one. But neither tool worked here. The hair itself was badly degraded by a century in storage, and Sitting Bull fathered only daughters, which meant there was no unbroken Y-chromosome thread to follow at all. Here is where it gets complicated in a way no one saw coming. Professor Eski Willerslev of the University of Cambridge and the Lundbeck Foundation Geogenetics Center led a team that spent 14 years, not 14 weeks, 14 years, developing an entirely new technique to extract autosomal DNA from the sample, genetic material inherited from both parents at once, rather than the single-line paternal or maternal threads standard tests rely on, closer to reading an entire shared ledger instead of one column of it. Using that method, they compared the extracted DNA against Ernie LaPointe and other Lakota Sioux relatives. In 2021, published in Science Advances, they confirmed the match. The study's own authors describe it as the first published case of confirming a familial relationship between a living person and a historical individual using such a minimal, degraded amount of ancient DNA across such a distant span of generations. Sit with that for a moment. If the single most documented, most iconic Lakota leader in American history needed a brand new scientific method, 14 years in the making, just to prove one family's direct descent, then Lakota bloodline was never the simple, fixed, self-evident thing that either the skeptics or the believers assumed it to be. It was never a closed genetic ledger sitting untouched since time immemorial. It was always something reconstructed, through oral memory, through mission and treaty records, through tribal roles, and now, finally, through a genetic record that itself carries a 300-year-old European paternal thread most people never knew was woven through it. Reconstructed, not discovered. Reconstructed. Because the Oceti Sakowin was never a closed genetic population to begin with. It was, and still is, a political and linguistic alliance, one that absorbed, adapted, and renegotiated exactly who belonged to it, generation after generation, war after war, marriage after marriage. The DNA didn't just answer one family's question about one 19th century leader. It quietly revealed that the whole idea of a single fixed Lakota bloodline was itself a story. A useful one, in many ways a sacred one, but a story all the same. Widen the lens now, past the Lakota entirely, because this pattern is not unique to them. Every nation on Earth, given enough genetic scrutiny, dissolves the same way. The pure ancestor, the "we have always been here" story that every people tells about itself, turns out under close enough examination to be a single snapshot pulled from a much longer, much messier migration, one frame from a film that never actually stopped rolling. What makes the Lakota case unusual isn't that this happened to them, it's how visible the seams are. A language whose deepest roots sit in the wrong region entirely. A disputed Y-chromosome lineage that scientists themselves, more than 15 years after first identifying it, still cannot agree how to read. A 14-year genetic method, invented from scratch, just to answer a single family's question about a single 19th century man. As one researcher close to the Sitting Bull case put it privately, the science didn't hand the family an identity. It just finally caught up to something the family had never stopped knowing on its own. What actually held the Oceti Sakowin together across 3 centuries of migration, war, and quiet genetic mixing was never blood purity. It was language, ceremony, land, and choice. Renewed, deliberately, by every single generation that decided, against every pressure pulling the other way, to remain Lakota. Think of it less like a bloodline and more like a river, the water in it never the same water twice, fed by tributaries no single traveler upstream could have named. and yet unmistakably, undeniably, still the same river, carrying the same name, cutting the same course toward the sea. The Lakota were never who the buffalo hunter myth said they were. DNA didn't destroy that story. It just revealed how much bigger and how much stranger the truth underneath it always was. And that river is still running, right now, further than anyone standing at its source could ever have seen.